Okay. So that's Zoom logistics. Joe Marks, do you want to start us off with a reflection of the day?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Greg. So I want to say so each year on June 19th, communities across this country host programs and activities to recognize Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day or Jubilee Day. While the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that slavery was ended in the United States when Union troops reached um, and took control of Galveston, Texas. So this marks the 155th anniversary of this significant historic event. And so it was interesting when Greg asked me to do this reflection on the day because I told him I had just thought about this, that in all however many years I've been alive, I have never actually formally celebrated Juneteenth myself. I grew up in Detroit during the time in which Detroit was probably the largest Black community in the country, at least percentage wise, compared to the city's total population. And I never learned about this in school. Um, that being said, it's June 19th in school. That's out the first week of June in Detroit. But still, to that point, it didn't make sense to me that I didn't learn about this until I was in college. And I say all of this because the work that we're doing is about education. And I think that given this day and the fact that it's come to light for so many people in their last week, that this is even a holiday and has been around for such a long time. Um, I think that we as a group need to reflect and think about the importance of education, not just on our current world status related to COVID-19, related to racial disparities, related to other forms of civil unrest that are going on, but also that we have this larger, more global mission to improve education across the world. And so that's what I want us to think about, not just those struggles that we in the US have related to race or other forms of oppression, but that there are other forms of education that we need to be thinking about, and how can we contribute to both that microcosm and then to the macrocosm of education.
Yes. So thank you. And, we're here today for something that hopefully is a historic moment of beginning this thing that Chris Purifoy, named the Internet of Education. Right? And if it's going to be really at the scale of the internet, then it has to be for everyone. And I think, you know, Sharon and other folks have helped us kind of just sort of reflect on the fact that honestly, 95% of the most active participants in education technology standards things happen to be white males from Canada and the US. And while we want to really be inclusive, we also really want to make sure that what we're doing is driven by, um, by the needs of all of the learners in the globe. And so that's what we're going to really be talking about today. So I'm just going to quickly say, in terms of context, and I sent out an email to everyone, that, thanks to everyone on this call and many other people, it's a different world than it was 18 months ago. 18 months ago, we talked about standards bodies fighting with each other. We lamented the lack of shared utilities, data utilities, and we didn't really have any proof points to collaborate with. And all of that has really changed now. The IEEE call a couple weeks ago kicking off the work that Jerry and Jim are doing on conceptual model, and Simone and I are helping to facilitate on the integrated learner record. There's really a coming together of standards. And this meeting is designed to really talk about shared utilities and then what is necessary to govern those shared utilities. And then we'll be continuing to work with the T3 Innovation Network and all the Ed3 research network co-laboratories to really encourage sharing of recommended practices so we can all learn from each other. So that's all I wanted to set for context. And Drummond, I don't know whether, is this picture a good picture for you to speak from? Muted, Drummond.
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's the picture to speak from. Hi everyone. I'm Drummond Reed at Everton, my Chief Trust Officer, but I've been helped over the last couple of years bring up the Sovereign Foundation and the Sovereign Network, which is one of the public utilities at Layer 1 that I'll explain in just a second. And then I've worked with John Jordan and Steve and a number of other folks to help launch the Trust over IP Foundation in the first week of May, which just passed 100 members. So it's growing very rapidly. Now, what you're looking at is what we call the Trust over IP stack. And I'm going to quickly explain how it sets the context for this whole conversation. So this is the two sides, the governance stack and the technology stack, collectively define an architecture for digital trust infrastructure that is designed to scale to the entire internet, very much like the what's referred to as the TCP/IP stack. That is the stack of protocols that are supported in every machine and device that connects to the internet. It was the evolution of that protocol or that stack, 50 years ago, or 40 to 50 years ago, that then enabled the internet to happen. And it's, they're open standards, they're ubiquitously supported. That's how all machines talk to all of the machines on the internet. Unfortunately, when they created the TCP/IP stack back then, everybody knew everybody on the internet, and trust was not an issue. Well, I think no one needs any convincing that trust has become an enormous issue on the internet. So, and we've, literally last couple of decades of my career has been, how do we address that problem? How do we address issues like digital identity, forming secure connections, maintaining privacy? So what's emerged in the last couple of years is this stack you see in front of you, which we now believe, as we fully standardize and implement this stack, can give us a trust layer that spans the entire internet as well. And so I just want to quickly explain to you why these 4 layers and the opportunity this sets up specifically for the Internet of Education. The base layer and what's led to this whole new paradigm for how to achieve digital trust is the ability for what we call public utilities to serve as cryptographic roots of trust, very strong ways that we can establish that 2 parties can prove digitally assertions that they're sharing with each other about about their identities or their attributes, so you can really have a high level of assurance and who you're talking to. Now, those, you don't see the word blockchain appearing there because there's a number of ways to provide a public utility that will do that. I'm pointing, I don't know if you can see my screen or you can do the pointing, Greg, just at the utility. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So that's what we're talking about there. Those the DID stands for decentralized identifier. Yep, that's even clearer there. And it's a new way of basically identifying a public key and other cryptographic metadata that's on a blockchain or distributed ledger, distributed file system, whatever it is. It's a very, very strong way of asserting that there is a controller of a set of cryptographic keys that you can be confident those really are the keys that belong to that party, and they can prove it to you. And so that's why networks like the Sovereign Ledger have been established. There are other ones coming. The Hyperledger Indy project at the Hyperledger at the Linux Foundation is open standard software that's been developed to do that, but you can also use permissionless networks like Bitcoin or Ethereum or others at that layer, and governance frameworks at that layer, such as the Sovereign Governance Framework we spent 3.5 years on at the Sovereign Foundation, establish how those things can be run in a way that can be, produce a high degree of trust. Nodes running around the world to produce a blockchain is very difficult to, to take down or violate the integrity of. That's that base layer and the part that sort of makes the whole stack possible. Layer 2 is critical because this is how we now finally get to digital agents and digital wallets that are interoperable across systems. They're not like the wallets we have in our smartphones today that are proprietary wallets from the vendors of those devices. We need open standard wallets, work very much like our browsers. A browser can talk to any website, and it doesn't, you can use any choice of a modern browser to talk to a website today. You're not locked in. We need the same thing for digital wallets and agents, and that connection you see between them is actually a cryptographically secure channel that can be negotiated in a fraction of a second between any two agents and wallets on any two devices, very much like any two devices on the internet can connect to each other. And again, the governance frameworks on the left that you'll see for that layer are how we set privacy, security, data protection, inclusion standards for those. Now, layer 3 is the essence of the heart of the stack, because what you see there on the right side is what we call the trust triangle. That applies to all credentials, whether they're physical ones, the ones you carry in your wallet today, or what you'll have in a digital wallet. They all have issuers that issue the wallet issue the credential into the holder, which keeps it in their digital wallet. And then their holders, whatever they need to prove something about themselves, produce a proof of those credentials to a verifier. Just like you show a mobile boarding pass to get onto a plane today, very similar ceremony for showing proof of a digital credential to a verifier, but it can also be done at distance, over the internet, in person. They all work. And those credentials are trusted because the verifier is able to cryptographically prove that it came from the DID, the decentralized identifier of the issuer, and the layer 1 is used to do that verification. So at layer 3, you have credential governance frameworks that basically say, here are the authorized issuers for a particular type of credential. Here are the policies followed to issue that credential so that the verifiers can be confident in it. The easiest proxy to understand how that works is think about the credit card networks today. You have banks issuing credit cards to cardholders that then can go to merchants to verify them, but it is the MasterCard or Visa governance frameworks that enable that whole system to be trusted. And that finally takes us up to the layer that's most relevant here to this conversation. The first 3 layers enable now entire digital trust ecosystems of applications and services that can use a whole, families of credentials under one overall, what we call ecosystem governance framework, that can all be interoperable. They can all derive trust between the various actors. And whether they're issuers or holders or verifiers. And when it comes to all of the different types of credentials involved in the Internet of Education, you're looking at, in my opinion, and this is what I said in January at the event that Sharon hosted, one of the largest and richest digital trust ecosystems in the world, perhaps the largest, because it involves potentially all educational institutions every place. And so the potential is for there to be an overarching digital trust ecosystem that's, again, don't think federated, think it is absolutely an ecosystem, but the DNA of trust for that ecosystem starts with that governance framework. And this is our opportunity with the launch of the Trust of IP Foundation. We have something called the Ecosystem Foundry Working Group, which is literally a working group set up to enable and incubate the development of ecosystem governance frameworks for projects like this. So the context here is a proposal to start a task force. It's already been drafted. Maybe you're going to show that wiki page, Greg, that this work can now begin in the context of doing that. Yeah, there it is right there. Well, let's see. Yeah, you got it. So that's the proposal here, to have a task force, or to begin a task force. The wiki page is there. It's basically ready now to get going as fast as this group wants to dive into it. So I hope that helps, Greg.
Awesome. Yeah, so when we met at Sharon's event, and she put us in a little conference room together, me and Drummond, and I said, so how would we do this then? And he said, well, you would need to define the purpose, the principles, and the protocols, right? And so, that's what we started doing. And then we had one meeting there in Dan Gold's office a month later, where first draft of that we shared with folks in Colorado and folks in Arizona. And now we're back to kind of really make this happen. So when I asked, how do we do this? So what are we governing, right? And my sense is that what we're governing is a directory of trusted issuers of identity, ontologies, and verifiable credentials in the education space. And so Stephen Curran, when we met earlier this week, described this to you, and he said, yeah, we just did this in BC, in British Columbia, and we've got some technology that we can work with, and we can stand up, at least a proof of concept of this very rapidly, right? Stephen, do you want to just talk about that? But what would be the practical steps of what we would do?
Sure. Can I share my screen? I've got a presentation that's sort of, and a story to tell that sort of walks through that and gives a framework. Okay. There we go. All right, so I've got a name, Ed Book. That's what we're starting with. You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So can't start a trust over IP discussion without seeing this. So we'll start there. What I'm going to be talking about is actually, Drummond said layer 4 is the most important, but I'm going to talk about layer 3. So I'm going to talk about how we get trust at layer 3. And in particular, how we can determine who's an authoritative issuer of credentials. And to do that, we're going to use a mechanism called the credential registry. And it's that framework that I'm going to talk about now. So the story I want to tell starts with this, which is the trust triangle that everyone is familiar with. I'm just moving some things around. I've got the chat up just in case I need it. An institution, a university gives a credential to a student. Student gives it to a verifier, protection employer, perhaps another school. And originally what started with, the school gave a piece of paper. The student showed the piece of paper, and that implied trust from that the verifier trusted that the issuer had provided this, that this student had earned it and provided that trust. Next evolution, Next evolution was that we didn't necessarily trust the student that much to do the right thing. So the verifier would directly ask the university, hey, give me the transcripts of student X, and they would physically pass that over through some mechanism. And so that became a way to get that trust enabled, because let's get that darn student out of the way, and we can trust it more. With verifiable credentials, we go back to the older model of the student presents it and the trust is implied. I reverse the direction of the trust to match the trust over IP stack. There's lots of controversy over which direction that arrow should point, but I'll ignore that. So that's what we've got. Now, the verifier has to figure out, do they trust the issuer, right? So if they get lots of these, they have to decide how, under what authority does that university hand out that transcript? Is their framework, their structure upon which they're based, if the check from the student is cashed, that is good enough for a PhD in their organization? Or does the student actually have to do some proving of their knowledge and their effort and their expertise before they get a degree. So that comes from some sort of higher level authority that grants the institution the right, the authority to issue credentials, to issue attestations to the student that they have met the qualifications of the degree to which they've been granted. So you've got some sort of authority that provides that, and that authority may come from another. So for example, several of the universities in British Columbia are established through the legislative process, and then the BC legislative process derives from the Canadian legislative process. Every jurisdiction, every school has a kind of a different structure of which its authority is granted. Sometimes I guess they just give themselves that authority. It varies all over the place, and that's what we're trying to determine. So that's the real world we have today. But of course, and then this hierarchy could go on arbitrary depth. That's what we have today. That's the real world that we're dealing with. And of course, in all of this, we're talking scale. None of this happens in small little transactions between, one or two people, and the verifier can just look at the document or can just contact the school. It's all got to be done at internet scale, and in fact, global internet scale, because these institutions are everywhere. Students, everything's everywhere. So that's difficult. That's hard to do. That's why you're here. I believe I heard this several times, that it fits the model of this is why you're here. How do you make it easy for the verifier to figure out what the heck they've got? What does this transcript mean? Where is it from? How did that authority derive that transcript could be issued, and so on? I wrote, or I collaborated on a document, a Google Doc a while ago called Traversing the Web of Trust. And basically it sort of accounts how you would do this in a verifiable credential world. The student hands over the credential to the verifier. The verifier can look at the cryptography and trust the student. The trusting the student is now out of the picture. They have a credential that they were issued. It was issued from somebody, and it has not been tampered with. We can figure all that out. So now we can trust what the student presented. This is good, but we have to figure out how the authority was granted to issue that credential. So the verifier might query the issuer and say, hey, how come you're allowed to do this? And the way that I envisioned perhaps this could happen was that institution could say, well, I have this verifiable credential that I was issued that says I'm allowed to grant. And so I got that from this other place. And so now the school has a credential from the student, but it also has the credential from the institution that knows why it's allowed to issue it. But then it doesn't recognize that authority that granted the authority to the institution. So now it's a verifiable credential back to the issuing authority, like the authority that provided the issuing, and so on and so on. And so basically they follow the chain back, they traverse the trust to figure out until they finally get to, oh, the government of Canada, I know who they are, I trust them. So now I'm going to trust all of the people in that sequence. I'm going to cache that information so when another student comes along and gives me another credential from that same school, I'm good to go. And that way you build up this trust, trust knowledge. You cache all this knowledge of trust, and you might check it once in a while to make sure it's still valid, but you build that up. Now that's a lot of work, and especially if every verifier's got to do that. So what if we had a book? We could call it Ed Book, and all the verifier had to do was go to that. When they get a credential from a student, they don't recognize the institution that granted the credential, and they look and say, hey, who is this? That would be good, but how do we get to an Ed Book? And this is literally where this, I think, where you guys are trying to go and trying to build it out, which is somebody in authority says, I've researched all of these places, this whole structure on the left side, and I know who the institutions are, and I know who grants them authority and so on. And so I can populate that book. And I don't know what organization it is. I know when I talked to Simon, about a year ago, he sent me links to a spreadsheet that has a ton of this information and it's available. And so one of the things that could be done is that information could be loaded in there. And so that's one way to do it. Of course, you want to scale that up because you don't want just one place, one authority that manages it all. So you might want multiple people that are sort of filling that out. But even better to do eventually is sort of have the issuers just say who are the issuers of the authority and grant them access to populate the ed book. So that's sort of the structure we're talking about. And that's what we want to get to, so that there's authority. So authoritative data comes to the verifier from the students, and authoritative data is available in this public repository, this credential repository that gives them information about the transcript, this information that they receive. What does it mean? Who gives them the authority to do it, and so on. So that's what kind of the technical structure that we built up. So where that leads to, couple of features of EdBook, and my dog's running around, so I hope, there he goes. A couple more features of that is there's a web search interface, so that in addition to just being able to an API to query this and a verification of credentials, you've got people can go look at it and they can see what institutions are, and it provides that level of interface. And as well, one really important feature, which is the EdBook, as we've implemented, not only takes in this information and allows you to query it, but you can subscribe to pieces of it that are of interest to you and get notifications back. So if you say as a verifier, oh, I'm going to trust School X, you could subscribe to School X so that every time something changes, so a legislative authority or an authority updates their credential, changes the information about them, you can be notified about it and decide if you need to do something about that. And that, again, could be super useful because it allows you to keep a local copy, but not have to, not have to periodically check it and make sure if it's still fresh. You would get notified if it's fresh. Or you might want to be notified when a new school is added to a jurisdiction. So you might want to track the jurisdiction to find out all the schools that get added in that area, things like that. So that's the capability that we're building up in a thing called Aries VCR, which is a verifiable credential registry. So that's where that comes from, VCR. A little bit about it. It's a community holder of credentials about something. It is generic in that it is agnostic to what credentials are put in it. So it is designed in a way that it can sort of hold these concepts, these structures, but can be used in any application. So there's a link in here, and I'll share this all. This is the GitHub repo link. Book BC is an instance of an Aries VCR. It contains public credentials about every registered organization in British Columbia. So it is registered organizations being corporations, partnerships, sole proprietorships. The registrar of British Columbia feeds that database with information, and as well, permits and license holders in the BC government feed that. So all of that information gets collected and available about the registered organization. So that's another domain using the same sort of technology. Agnostic credentials. It's got certain contexts that enable search terms, things like names, locations, the types of credentials held, that allow searching for that, both an API searching interface and a human, just using the interface to it. Web interface searching, it manages the credential lifecycle. So as a credential expires, a new credential is issued that replaces an old one, it takes care of that and shows you a history of an institution. So that can be managed. There's the subscription webhook, which I talked about. Subscribe to a credential and get notified when it changes. And then it allows a list of issuers who's allowed to issue to the credential registry. So that's a big feature. It's important. It allows you to control who is the authoritative source. It allows you to put it. So the tasks that gives this organization, this sort of gives you a skeleton of technology at which to base the human parts of this, governance part of it, which is what information should be in the ed book credentials? Who are the issuers to it? Who's allowed to issue it? How do you come up with a initial list? How do you bootstrap the use of it? You are not going to get to the end state right away. I'm not going to have issuers to this registry on day one, but you're going to have to bootstrap it up, and you're going to have to do it in a way that it's trusted on every step of the way. And so that's sort of the way you start. So with that,
that's perfect. Yeah, I think that's perfect. And so
there you go.
So then, exactly. So now, if
Turn it
Sharon,
over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. And so I'll hand it over to you, Sharon, so who should govern this? Who should make these decisions? You know, is it the people on this call? Is it no one on this call? What's a fair way to think about it, right? Sharon, do you want to help us have that conversation?
I don't know if I have all of the answers. So hi, everyone that I've met and have not met. For those of you I've not met, my name is Sharon Liu, and I work at the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. From my house, actually, not from the office. So I actually really appreciate like the information and a lot of what people have said earlier. And I guess I'll say one thing about knowing me is, like, to Greg's point, you can always meet in our office space if you would like, because we are officially phase 1 opened, so you can get permission to do that. But other than the ability to meet in my space, I think there are very little other advantages of knowing me, because what you'll realize very quickly is that I am a troublemaker. And so when we were first talking about this, Greg and I, and then I think with Chris and Taylor and some others, I think what I said was, this is amazing, right? Because the mission of the Department of Education, and a lot of why I'm personally motivated to do some of this work, is that I actually feel like we always make this promise that education is is the engine of opportunity. And education, if you just get the right kind and the right combinations, will open all kinds of doors for everyone. And because I'm American, this will unlock the American dream, and everyone will live happily ever after. But I think, unfortunately, we have systems and institutions in place that are not that are not equal for everyone. And so I think that with the tools that technology provides us, we can really get to a place where we do open the doors for opportunity. And so I think that one of the things that makes me the most excited about this project, and not even like governance or anything like that, but it's just this idea that if this is actually, to your all's point earlier, an internet for education, and if it really is for everyone, then I think that we need to take a very, very, close look at what we mean when we say everyone, and to think about how can we be inclusive in the design of what we do, not just in a governance structure, but what does it mean to be inclusive by design in how the technology is built? What does that mean? Especially because we know that not just the diversity of learners in the United States and across the world, but it's just, I think that gosh, I'm not gonna say special snowflake, but everyone is different. Everyone's needs are different, and the way that the internet is customized to me is that it's what I want it to be when I want it to be. And so I took a look at the document, and I fight my temptation to just write in it, so I didn't. And I also am cognizant of the time that we have, and so I don't really have specific things that I would like to offer. I guess I'm going to put into the chat right now some of like a framing that I think that might work. Okay, so hold on, let me just double check the permissions on this, because I'm using my really amazing Department of Ed official Google, and I think if I don't set the link permissions right, you won't get it. But essentially, let's see, get link. Hold just a minute. I should have prepared better with the link and edit. Copy, done. Okay, so what this document is a copy and paste of the protocol section, sort of. But actually wanted to propose if we could rethink how we address the issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So right now, under the protocol section, there are 6 bulleted items: equity, open participation, inclusion, diversity, effectiveness, and proportional influence. But I guess what I wanted to propose, even if we keep that same structure, I'm not going to do some line editing right now, is like we would ask ourselves the broader questions about like the big picture of a TOIP infrastructure and what would it look like to take a truly inclusive design approach. And I came up with 3 categories of questions. I don't know the answers, but I think that they could be a way that we frame this conversation. And the first is just this idea of what does it mean to have a learner-centric approach? So we're designing this new world for people. And I think far too often in my world, we're very guilty of it, of saying, look, we designed this great policy for you, or we designed this great program, or here's this magical technology. And it's going to fix everything for everyone all the time. And we are not actively developing empathy for the people that we are creating these things for. We don't seek their feedback early. We don't get their input as far as improving. So are there ways that we can be truly learner-centric in our approach to designing the Internet of Education? And how do we incorporate throughout the entire design process of everything that we do, this idea of developing empathy and adapting to it? The second thing that I would like to propose is that we use the word inclusion a lot. And I would like to take, I tend to think of it as the opposite, where inclusion is the opposite of exclusion. So thinking about like the ways that we exclude others from participation, either actively or passively. And then for us to take a target and strike approach to eliminating those barriers. So for example, and I'm not picking on all of you, I'm gonna say this, I so appreciate the work that you all do, but like, where are the ladies on this call, right? And like, why are there not more women in this group? And I don't know the answer to that. I want us to know though, like, but I feel like to my previous point, like, is there something that we could do to understand more why groups are not more heterogeneous? And like, if there are specific barriers, could we be actively working to eliminate them? And that is both in the governance of an organization, but also in the way that technology is deployed and developed. And then the third thing is like, how do we hold each other as a group accountable for progress? And I think very fundamentally, there's a question of what are the metrics and how do we determine progress? You know, is it like on a fundamental level, increasing representation of different types of individuals, both in the design process, the governance process? Is it on a deeper level, thinking about internal changes, behaviors, policies that not just apply to our small group, but the groups with which we work with? And how do we sort of, you know, transmit our values? And then sort of third is like, what does it mean to actually have an equity lens to some of the work that we're working on? And you know, it is an interesting thing, because on the one hand, it's like technology, like maybe it's just lines of code, right? So, but on the other hand, I think it could be a little bit more rich than that. So I don't actually have answers. Like I said, I'm just a professional troublemaker. And so I have like, I don't know what, Greg, I'll take your lead on this, but tell me like a little bit more of like.
No, I mean, I'm just like you. I think that you and I have, like, our superpowers are convening other smart people, right? And then creating a collective intelligence that wasn't there before. And, you know, I met Chris Purifoy and Jackson at your first event. I met Drummond at your second event, right? I mean, and hopefully I've introduced people together as well, right? So really, I think what we're trying to do is just kind of pull together, you know, good people and then try to address these problems. So, I mean, maybe we just open it up now, you know, to anyone who wants to, is that?
You know, I just want to hop in there. This is Chris Purifoy. I just want to say, Sharon, we appreciate your troublemaker. I just want to, and I think a lot of people will +1 that. I mean, this is really what we need. And I know there was a push to make this more diverse, and it is difficult sometimes. And I think we need to be pushing into that. And I think that I love your idea about, inclusion being more about, what we leave out. And I think that's really, really critical. And it needs to be approached here, because this is a work stream that I believe will fail if we don't accomplish that. So I just want to say I appreciate it.
So we want to be in action, right? I think that's the main thing, is that we want to be not just mouthing the words, but really modeling the actions and ensuring that, these ideas are what shapes what Stephen just described in order to fulfill what Drummond just described, right?
So Greg, this is Matthew Hellstone. I just wanted to, there's a distinction inside the chat there, I think, that we need to make between what credentials are and what they mean. We have this verifiable credential, which is a digital format, right? And a digital structure. And then we have the ontology and the definition of what's the type of data that goes into a credential. And that type of data really then describes the governance, right? And so there's all different levels, and I appreciate, Nate, you bringing in credential engine, right? What's in there? And I think there's a particular governance into who has the authority or who is at least recognized, right? And there's some kind of an assertion there of some governing body, and maybe it's just a self-assertion that we offer these types of, pardon me, ontology credentials, and it has this learning data in it, or it has some kind of recognition. So I think that the digital format and structure, and what I think Stephen and John and Drummond were describing in this digital repository that can be used to verify assertion of a particular ontology is their kind of structure that they're defining. But there's also, on top of that, a governing structure around that ontology that gives it semantic meaning. And so we need to be really careful when we're talking about credentials and the specifics of the mechanics of the digital structure and infrastructure that supports it, and then the governing bodies around the ontology and data that's inside of that credential that gives it meaning and purpose to the and the layer 4 kind of infrastructure and ecosystem that we're creating.
So Matthew, but let's just get right to it of like, but who gets to decide? How can we make sure that the resulting Internet of Education is fair and equitable?
I think it can be self-organizing or a decision of whoever wants. If we want the Department of Education to be a governing authority over particular things and recognition, and saying, we recognize these institutions for being issuers in a particular way, that could work. If we have accreditation bodies that self-organize to say, we are a self-organization of accreditation institutions, and they say, we're recognized from this is our ontology, and this is the data that we have, and we're using the same type of digital infrastructure to provide it, and giving our own directory and repository. That's fine too. I think that we just need to decide within our scope who is the governing bodies for what we want to define. I think other organizations can self-organize as well, and my internet connection looks like it's unstable. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah, we could hear you.
Okay, good. Anyway, does that make sense what I'm saying? So I think it's up to to decide what is our ontology and who's the governing body around that ontology. And the infrastructure can support that. We can create these digital repositories that have these credentials that are queryable and verifiable in a way that Stephen and John are describing.
Sharon,
hey, this is. Hey, thanks, Greg. This is Nate. I think that the stack here is a great place to start, and this conversation is a great place to start. We have to embed principles of the ability to for any organization to be able to start up and enter the ecosystem as a credential issuer from the beginning, without like putting in sort of hard gates there. And we can build the technology in a way so that there is a peer-to-peer relationship where the trust is determined. Different consumers will have different requirements as far as which credentials they trust. You may, in the U.S., trust a particular set of accreditors, and for a higher education genre of or sector of credential, you may need a endorsement chain that goes back to one of 6 particular providers that are unique to you. But there may be other providers that you accept for different credentials, and there may be other organizations that choose a different set of sort of root trust authorities themselves. And so if we embed a principle of openness into our ecosystems so that we ensure issuers can begin providing service and are eligible to receive endorsements and to be, have those endorsements placed into registries where they're queryable and verifiable. That is a great start, and it allows us to have an ecosystem that is a little bit heterogeneous, that it has a diversity of different types of purposes and different authorities for which credentials are recognized.
So Nate, the questions I have up here is, maybe Sharon asks her colleague Ross Santee to say who all the state education agencies are, local education agencies are, and accredited institutes of higher ed in the US, because that's what NCS does, right? And so we could say, well, I trust NCS. And so NCS said who these people are, and we could ask Joe Marks and say, Joe Marks, who are all the med schools, right? And maybe we would trust, that you would then either write, the right entity to say who all the med. So and then maybe there's other, as people are saying, that there's other unofficial ways that these issuers can be recognized as well, because it's a closed system. But Jerry wanted to say something. Jerry, you raised your hand.
Yeah. It seems to me, and I don't know what the answer or the significance is, but in my mind, that the 3 challenges to inclusion in this are: one, is there still people at the level, especially for the primary schools, that just physically don't have the bandwidth and the digital access? And then, so 2, which is that even for the people who do, there's always a challenge of what's the cost of migration, and in both cases, does the self-organization allow for sort of a caste system to propagate? Oh, look, you're using version 1, but we have version 3, so clearly we're better, or more access, or whatever. In which case, it seems like there needs to be a disambiguation layer that lives in there somewhere, and probably a federally managed thing, where if you don't have the bandwidth and somebody had to process a whole bunch of paper certificates in order to be able to issue these badges, no one will know that, because the query will look the same at that top registry level from anybody who's trying to be a verifier.
Jerry, I'm just going to coach you on time of that. There's 3 other people who have their hands raised, and I also want to ask Linda if she's willing to speak as well.
Sure. Well, I'm done. But that was kind of my thought is that to avoid those first 2 things, we kind of need that 3rd thing.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, so hi, thanks, Greg. I am kind of really just trying to listen and learn. I'm definitely feeling like out of my depth, but happy to kind of be here, and maybe there's others that I can recruit to join. But I mean, I think I appreciate what Matthew's trying to say about the distinction between the terminology, and so I'm kind of here to add my voice and help contribute in any way I can.
Thank you. So we're going to go Matt and then Jackson, and then we'll end with John Jordan, who's in charge of the Trust Over IP network, and so he can give us a charge for next steps. Matt?
Great. So I guess the main question I'd love to pose to the group that I keep cycling on in my head is, in this question of representation, is what the geography of authority and trust in education looks like. I know, Greg, you're fond of the phrase, and it's a great phrase, there's only one internet, there needs to be only one internet of education. But at least from my observation, the geography of trust generally, and the geography of trust in education in particular, is a bit more bounded and looks a little bit more like how banking had to stitch together kind of regional identity providers for things like know your customer or KYC. And so I think one of the questions we should have in the representation question is the scope of this initially global or regional? And that should help guide, I think, principally what target representation should look like.
Yes, we discussed this a couple days ago. Should we say, well, half the, quarter of the representation should be native Chinese, and a quarter should be native folks from India, because that is the representation in the world? Or is there some other way of thinking about it in terms of, the pace in which different jurisdictions join in, and then the representation within those jurisdictions? But Jackson?
Yeah, thanks. And this actually dovetails perfectly, I think, off Matt's comment. I just want to quickly add, when I think about equity and inclusion, I think of power, resources, and format. It's one thing to be open and accessible, but voluntary, isn't necessarily always the best way to sort of motivate inclusion. And in terms of this geography, trust is that triangle. And trust isn't imposed, I think, on the ultimate end user of this. And no matter what, and however that is parsed geographically, students, learners, employees need to be at the table geographically, for making some of these governance decisions. And I think that margin where they are left out is where inclusion is cut. Second, in terms of resources, everyone on this call, a lot of us are here voluntarily. And that's because we have that sort of privilege and leisure to be here, whether it's for a job or not. And so I think to some extent, we need to make active commitments to resourcing efforts to include more folks. And then finally, format. I think Zoom calls are good. I like the hand raising, but to be very conscious and thoughtful about format in terms of time taking up and these kind of things that you were even just doing there, Gregory. So just thumbs up on that kind of process.
Awesome. John, John Jordan? So is this what you envisioned when you signed up to be Executive Director of Trust Over IP?
I don't know. It's great though. It's great to have this conversation, and actually putting on my other, actual day job hat as an Executive Director at the province of British Columbia. I just wanted to, I made some notes anywhere. So, we're very concerned about things like the digital divide and not making it worse. We have many, many small communities. We have many, many First Nations in BC that we work with on a government-to-government basis. And so we definitely are wanting to provide services and do things in the open, including open source tools that allow these municipalities and so forth to participate in the digital world. So I made some notes in the chat anyways, but I just wanted to include that, with my government hat on, these are concerns that come into play.
Okay, well, we've got 2 minutes left. So are there any final words people want to say? And otherwise, I'll just give a kind of a what's next at the very end.
Greg, there was a lot of activity on the Zoom chat. Are you going to capture that?
Yes.
Great, thanks.
I think we capture that automatically, Rob, right? Yeah.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
And it said when you joined that you were agreeing that this was recorded. Let me just say again, if anyone has any issue with any of this being broadcasted, we want to use this as an opening to invite others in around the world. And so, let me just say that, I personally am willing to, to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And so I'll keep on convening, Sharon with you, and Chris with you, and Matt with you, and all of the other conveners out there. And I'm also willing to follow. If anyone else wants to step up and to lead this, then I'll follow, or I'll get out of the way, whatever advances this mission. So, so I think we're out of time. Send me email, send others email. I don't know if we have a specific action step, but I think, we will be in action. I am committed to this happening, not in the next years, but in the next weeks and months. Right. So, you know, I think we can get this to happen this summer, that we are started, that we are working, that this is a functioning Internet of Education, and that the nodes that we're aware of, these implementations, the pilots, the reference implementations, the Ed 3.0 labs, all of those things are actually coming together in the Internet of Education this summer.